Marcus Williams sat in the waiting room of Sterling Enterprises. His worn suit jacket pressed as neatly as he could manage, with the old iron in his apartment, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the folder containing his resume. And when the receptionist called his name, he stood up, whispered a quiet prayer for his 8-year-old daughter Emma, waiting with the neighbor, and walked toward the office. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment the door opened and the woman standing there, the CEO herself, froze with wide eyes and gasped, "It's you," because 3 nights ago, Marcus had been walking home from his second shift warehouse job at 2 a.m., exhausted to his bones, thinking about how he'd have just enough time to sleep for hours before getting Emma ready for school, when he smelled smoke and heard screaming coming from the old apartment building on Maple Street, and without thinking, without considering his own safety, or the fact that he was the only parent. Emma had left since her mother passed 2 years ago from cancer. He ran toward the sound, kicked open the building's front door, that was already hot to the touch, and climbed through the smoke-filled stairwell, following the cries for help. On the 3rd floor, he found a woman collapsed in the hallway, overcome by smoke, her business suit covered in soot, her briefcase still clutched in one hand, and Marcus, who weighed only 170 pounds but had a father's strength born from carrying his daughter on his shoulders and lifting her spirits when the world felt too heavy, pulled this stranger up, draped her arm over his shoulder, and half carried, half dragged her down the stairs as the fire roared somewhere above them, the heat pressing down like a living thing, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming, but he kept moving, kept counting steps, kept thinking about Emma's face and how she'd already lost her mother and he couldn't let her lose him too. But this woman needed him right now, this moment. And he wasn't the kind of man who could hear someone crying for help and walk away. They burst through the front entrance just as the fire trucks arrived, sirens wailing, lights painting the street in red and blue, and Marcus laid the woman down on the sidewalk, coughing violently, and when the paramedics rushed over, he waved them toward her, insisting she needed help first. And in the chaos and the smoke and the shouting, Marcus slipped away because he had to get home before Emma woke up, had to be there to make her breakfast and braid her hair the way she liked it, even though he still wasn't very good at it, had to keep their small world spinning even though he was running on empty, even though the electric bill was overdue, and the rent was a constant weight on his shoulders, and he'd been applying for better jobs for months, praying for just one chance to give his daughter the life she deserved. That morning, Emma had wrapped her small arms around his neck at breakfast and said, "Daddy, you smell like smoke," and he'd told her he'd walked past someone's barbecue, hating the small lie but not wanting to worry her, and she'd smiled and said, "Mrs. Chen says you're the bravest daddy in the whole world," and Marcus had felt his throat tighten because he didn't feel brave. He felt tired and scared, and like he was always one emergency away from everything falling apart. But he kissed her forehead and promised her that everything would be okay, that the interview he had later that week might change things for them, might mean he could work 1 job instead of 3, might mean she could have new shoes instead of the ones held together with glue, might mean he could breathe again. The days between the fire and the interview had been a blur of work and worry, and Marcus hadn't told anyone about what he'd done that night, because in his mind it wasn't heroism, it was just what anyone should do, what his own father had taught him before passing away, when Marcus was just 19. "Son, your character is measured by what you do when nobody's watching, when there's no reward, when it costs you something," and those words had shaped the man Marcus became. The father he'd fought to be even when grief over losing his wife threatened to drown him, even when he'd held Emma during her nightmares and wondered if his love alone would be enough to fill the mother-shaped hole in her heart. He'd almost canceled this interview with Sterling Enterprises because his warehouse supervisor had denied his time-off request, and Marcus had nearly accepted that this opportunity would slip away like so many others. But then his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived through her own hardships and recognized a good man struggling when she saw one, had offered to watch Emma, and told him firmly, "You go to that interview, Marcus Williams. You go and you show them what kind of man they'd be lucky to have." And so here he was, standing in this pristine office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, facing Sarah Chennault, relation to his neighbor. He'd learned later a woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that were currently filling with tears as she gestured for him to sit down, her voice shaking as she said, "You saved my life 3 nights ago, and then you disappeared before I could thank you, before I could even ask your name. And I've had people searching. I posted on social media. I called hospitals and police stations, because I needed to find the man who ran into a burning building and carried me out and asked for nothing in return." Marcus sat slowly, his mind reeling, and managed to say, "I didn't know it was you, ma'am. I heard someone needed help." And Sarah sat down across from him, not behind her imposing desk, but in the chair next to his, as equals, and she said, "The fire department told me that building's stairwell was minutes from collapse, that the smoke inhalation I was suffering from would have killed me in less than 5 minutes, that whoever pulled me out risked their own life in a way that defies logic." And Marcus shook his head and replied quietly, "I have a daughter, 8 years old, and I thought about how, if you have people who love you, they'd want someone to try. Just like I'd want someone to try for me if Emma needed help and I wasn't there." And his voice cracked on his daughter's name because she was his everything, his reason for breathing, his purpose for pushing through exhaustion and disappointment, and the loneliness of being a single parent in a world that didn't make it easy. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, then looked at his resume, and Marcus watched her expression shift from emotion to something else, something thoughtful and sad, and she said, "Marcus, I need to be honest with you. I was in that building visiting my mother, who lives alone on the 4th floor, and after you got me out, I was screaming for the firefighters to go back for her, but they found her safe on the fire escape. She'd gotten out on her own, stubborn and independent, as always. And I realized that night how close I came to leaving her alone in this world, how close I came to leaving my son without his mother." And Marcus understood then that they'd both lived in that space between life and loss, had both known the weight of being needed, of having someone dependent on your survival. Sarah asked him questions then, real interview questions about his experience and skills, but also deeper questions about his life, his values, his dreams for his daughter. And Marcus found himself talking about Emma, about how she loved science and wanted to be a veterinarian, about how she'd started a kindness journal, where she wrote down one nice thing she did for someone each day, because he'd told her, that's how you build a good life, one kind act at a time. And Sarah listened with an intensity that made Marcus feel truly seen for the first time in years, not as a charity case or a struggling single father, but as a whole person with dignity and worth and something valuable to offer. She told him about her own journey, how she'd built Sterling Enterprises from nothing after escaping an abusive relationship 15 years ago, how she'd raised her son alone and knew the particular exhaustion of being everything to someone while trying to build a future, how she'd succeeded beyond her wildest dreams but never forgot what it felt like to choose between groceries and utilities, to smile at your child while your heart was breaking from stress. And Marcus felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, not just hope for the job, but recognition, the profound comfort of being understood by someone who'd walked a similar path. Sarah looked at him directly and said, "Marcus, the position you applied for is in our warehouse distribution center, and you're more than qualified for it. And if you want it, it's yours. Better pay, benefits, reasonable hours. But I'm looking at your resume, and I see something else. I see someone who's been working multiple jobs for years, who's reliable and hardworking, and has more leadership experience than you're giving yourself credit for." And she paused, seeming to wrestle with something, before continuing, "What I need, what Sterling Enterprises needs, is a director of community outreach, Someone who understands what it means to struggle, who has genuine empathy, who makes split-second decisions to help others, even at personal cost. And I think you might be exactly who we need. But I don't want you to think this is charity or pity because of what you did for me. I need you to know this is a legitimate offer, based on who I see you are as a person and what you could bring to this company. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly, felt his carefully constructed composure crumble as tears he'd been holding back for 2 years, since the day they buried his wife, and he'd promised Emma he'd be strong enough for both of them, finally broke free. And he put his head in his hands and wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being valued, of having a door open just when he'd been running out of strength to keep knocking. And Sarah reached across and put a gentle hand on his shoulder, this woman he'd pulled from smoke and fire. And she said softly, "You gave me my life back, Marcus. Let me give you an opportunity to reclaim yours." And he lifted his head and said, "I don't know anything about community outreach. I don't have a degree. I'm not qualified." But even as he said it, he thought about how he'd built a support network in his apartment building, how neighbors called him when they needed help, how he'd organized a food share program through his daughter's school, how he'd always been the one coordinating, connecting, bringing people together, not because it was a job, but because community was survival for people like him who couldn't afford to be islands. Sarah smiled and said, "I'll teach you what you don't know. We'll get you training. You'll have support. But the things I can't teach, integrity, courage, genuine compassion, you already have those in abundance." And Marcus realized this was the moment his life could pivot, the moment all the hardship could become foundation rather than weight, the moment he could show Emma that kindness does come back around. Maybe not always, maybe not quickly, but sometimes the universe aligns, and doing the right thing leads somewhere beautiful. He thought about his daughter waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table, glancing at the door every few minutes, hoping to see him come through with good news. And he thought about all the times he'd come home with disappointment instead, with another rejection letter, another failed opportunity, and how she'd always hugged him and said, "It's okay, Daddy. Something better is coming," with the unshakable faith of a child who still believed the world was fundamentally good because he'd worked so hard to shelter her from the evidence otherwise. And he knew he was about to walk through that door with news that would change everything. That would mean he could tuck her in at night without the knot of anxiety in his stomach. That would mean she could do activities with other kids without him calculating every dollar. That would mean he could breathe and rest and maybe, for the first time since his wife died, actually live instead of just survive. Marcus wiped his eyes and looked at Sarah and said, "If you're serious, if this is real, then yes, I accept, and I promise you won't regret it. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll learn everything I need to know. I'll make you proud." And Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy, and replied, "Marcus, you already made me proud when you ran into a burning building for a complete stranger. Everything else is just details." And they spent the next hour discussing salary more than he'd made at all 3 jobs combined, and benefits and start date, and the programs she envisioned, initiatives to help struggling families in the community, partnerships with schools and shelters, and Marcus contributed ideas from his own experience, feeling his mind come alive in a way it hadn't in years, realizing he'd been so focused on survival that he'd forgotten he was actually intelligent and capable, and had something valuable to offer beyond just his labor. When Marcus finally left Sterling Enterprises, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in golds and pinks, and he stood on the sidewalk outside the building and called Mrs. Chen, his voice thick with emotion as he said, "I got it. I got something even better than I hoped." And her delighted laugh crackled through the phone. And then Emma's voice came on, breathless and excited. "Daddy, did you get the job?" Mrs. Chen says, "You got the job." And he said, "Baby girl, Daddy got a really good job. Things are going to be different now, better. I promise, and Emma squealed with joy and said, "I knew it, Daddy. I knew something good was coming. I wrote in my kindness journal that you're the best daddy in the world, and good things happen to good people." And Marcus had to hold the phone away for a moment because he was crying again. But this time Emma's words struck him differently, because maybe she was right. Maybe the kindness he'd tried to build his life around, the values he'd clung to even when it would have been easier to become bitter and hard, maybe it all mattered. Maybe it all meant something. He walked home slowly, wanting to savor this feeling, this lightness. And he thought about the chain of events that had led here, his wife's death teaching him about fragility and precious time, the years of struggle teaching him resilience and empathy, the random chance of walking down Maple Street at exactly the moment Sarah needed help, the courage or foolishness or love that had sent him running into danger, and Sarah's remarkable grace in seeing past the circumstances to who he really was. And he understood that life wasn't always fair, and good things didn't always happen to good people. But sometimes they did, and you had to be ready to receive blessing with the same grace you'd handled hardship. That night, Marcus sat with Emma on their worn couch in their small apartment that suddenly felt less like a trap and more like a launching pad. And he told her an edited version of the story, about helping someone and how kindness created unexpected connections. And Emma listened with wide eyes and said, "Daddy, you're like a real-life superhero." And he pulled her close and said, "No, baby, I'm just a dad who's trying his best. But maybe that's enough." And she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and said, "It's more than enough. You're more than enough." And in that moment, Marcus felt something heal inside him, some wound he'd been carrying since his wife died. The fear that he alone wouldn't be sufficient for this precious child, that his best wouldn't measure up, but Emma's words wrapped around that fear and soothed it. And he realized she'd been okay all along. They'd been okay together, and now they were going to be even better. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of transition as Marcus started his new position, and Sarah was true to her word, providing training and mentorship and treating him as a valued colleague rather than a charity project. And Marcus threw himself into the work with passion, developing programs that helped single parents find childcare and job training, creating partnerships with local businesses to provide employment opportunities for people with gaps in their resumes, building support networks for families in crisis. And every initiative came from his own experience, from knowing intimately what it meant to need help and how hard it was to ask for it, how much dignity mattered even in desperation, how a hand up delivered with respect could change someone's entire trajectory. Sarah and Marcus developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding, and sometimes she'd call him into her office just to ask his opinion on company decisions, valuing his perspective from the margins. And once she told him, "You know, that fire didn't just take my building. It burned away my assumptions about success. I'd become so focused on profit and growth that I'd forgotten why I started this company, to create opportunities for people like us, people who needed a chance, and you reminded me of that. You reminded me what actually matters." And Marcus understood that he'd given her something too, that the rescue had been physical, but the real saving had been mutual. Two people pulling each other toward better versions of themselves. Months passed, and Emma flourished with the stability, joining the science club at school and making friends and lighting up when Marcus could now afford to say yes to field trips and birthday parties, and watching his daughter bloom free from the shadow of his stress. Marcus understood that breaking generational cycles of struggle was exactly this, not just providing money, but providing presence, peace, the emotional space for a child to simply be a child rather than worrying about their parent. And he felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with fulfilling the promise he'd made at his wife's grave, that he'd give their daughter a beautiful life, that her mother's love would continue through him. On the 1-year anniversary of the fire, Sarah invited Marcus and Emma to dinner at her home, and Emma met Sarah's son, a teenager who was kind and patient with the younger girl, and the four of them shared a meal that felt like family. Like the family both single parents had built from broken pieces. And after Emma and Sarah's son went to play video games in the other room, Sarah raised her glass and said, "To second chances and the courage to run toward fire instead of away from it." And Marcus touched his glass to hers and replied, "To the people who see us, really see us, and believe we're worth saving." And they sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Sarah said, "I've been thinking about franchising our community outreach model to other cities, and I'd want you to lead that expansion, train others to do what you've built here. Spread this further." And Marcus felt that now familiar surge of possibility, the sense that his life had cracked open into something bigger than he'd imagined, that the ceiling he'd accepted was actually just a door he hadn't known how to open. He thought about how a year ago he'd been running on empty, how he'd had every reason to walk past that burning building because he had his own problems, his own struggles, how no one would have blamed him for protecting himself first. But something in him, some fundamental part of who he was, shaped by his father's wisdom, refined by his wife's love, sharpened by his daughter's need, had made it impossible to hear someone crying for help and not respond. And that single choice, that moment of pure human compassion, had set everything else in motion, had saved not just Sarah's life, but in a way his own, had transformed both their futures, and rippled out to touch everyone their work now helped. And Marcus understood that this was the real meaning of heroism, not the dramatic rescue, but the daily choice to remain kind in a hard world, to stay open when it would be easier to close off, to believe that what we do for each other matters, even when we can't see the outcome. As Marcus drove Emma home that night, his daughter sleepy in the back seat, he thought about the story he'd tell her when she was older, about the night that changed everything, and he'd make sure she understood it wasn't magic or luck, but the culmination of living according to values, even when it cost him, of building character in the dark times, so it was there when the moment required it. And he'd tell her that she was his inspiration for all of it, that every time he'd wanted to give up, her face had kept him going. Her trust in him had made him worthy of that trust. And he'd teach her what his father taught him, and what he'd now proven to himself, that who you are when it's hard, when no one's watching, when there's no guarantee of reward, that's who you really are. And if you can be proud of that person, if you can build a life on integrity and compassion and courage, then doors open that you didn't even know existed, not because the universe owes you anything, but because that's the kind of person other good people want to walk alongside, want to invest in, want to build with. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, the same place he'd lived during the hardest years. But he'd decided not to move, because this was their community. These were the neighbors who'd helped raise Emma when he was working multiple jobs. This was where he'd learned that wealth wasn't just money but connection. And besides, the apartment held his wife's memory in ways a new place wouldn't. And Emma still liked to sit in the window seat where her mother used to read to her. And Marcus had learned that you don't run from grief, you integrate it. You let it make you deeper and more compassionate rather than bitter and closed. He carried his sleeping daughter upstairs, tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Your mama would be so proud of you, baby girl. And I promised to keep making her proud too." And then he sat in his living room, in the quiet of the night, and let himself feel the full weight of gratitude for the journey, the struggle and the breakthrough, the loss and the finding, the moment he ran into fire and the year of transformation that followed. And he understood that his life was becoming a story worth telling, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because it was about a regular man who chose love over fear, community over isolation, action over passivity, and found that those choices built a life of meaning, a legacy of kindness that his daughter would carry forward. And really, what more could any parent hope for than to raise a child who believes the world is worth saving because someone showed them, again and again, that people are worth saving, that we're all worth running into the fire for, that every life has dignity and value and the potential to transform everything if just given a chance. And as Marcus finally headed to bed, tired but peaceful, he thought about how he'd saved Sarah that night on Maple Street. But the truth was, they'd saved each other, and together they were saving others, and that's how it works. That's how we build a world worth living in, one act of unexpected courage at a time, one moment of seeing another person's humanity and responding with our own, one choice to be brave when it matters. And maybe that was the whole point of everything. The reason we're here, to lift each other up, to pull each other from the flames, to believe in second chances and new beginnings and the radical possibility that kindness, simple human kindness, can change absolutely everything.